The more complicated the world gets, the more powerful simplicity becomes. Everywhere you turn, there's more choices, more voices, more noise. We've been conditioned to believe that complexity equals advancement, that more is always better, that the path to sophistication is through accumulation. But it isn't. True sophistication doesn't come from having more. It comes from needing less. It comes from clarity, from refinement, from stripping away the unnecessary until only the essential remains. That's what simplicity really is. Not emptiness, but essence. It's not a lack of effort, it's the result of discipline. It takes courage to simplify. It takes confidence to stop overcompensating. And it takes wisdom to know when to stop adding and start subtracting. But in a world that rewards flash over function, speed over stillness, and clutter over clarity, simplicity feels like rebellion. Simplicity is not weakness, it's power. Controlled, intentional, deliberate power. Think about the greatest designs, the most memorable speeches, the most timeless ideas. They aren't overloaded with detail. They are stripped down to their purest form. And that's why they endure. Because when something is simple, it becomes clear. It becomes accessible. It becomes unforgettable. The same applies to your life. Simplicity in your schedule gives you focus. Simplicity in your relationships gives you peace. Simplicity in your goals gives you power. And simplicity in your mind gives you freedom. But most people are afraid of simplicity because it requires them to choose. It requires them to let go of distractions, of appearances, of ego. And letting go is hard. Complexity gives you something to hide behind. It makes you look busy, important, sophisticated. But all it really does is bury you, drown you, make you lose sight of what actually matters. That's why simplicity is rare, because it demands honesty. You can't fake simplicity, you can fake hustle. You can fake ambition, you can fake perfection, but you can't fake clarity. Either you know what matters, or you don't. Either you're aligned, or you're scattered. Either you're living with intention, or you're reacting to chaos. Simplicity draws that line. It exposes what you've been avoiding. And that's exactly why it's so powerful, because the moment you embrace simplicity, you stop trying to prove yourself, and you start being yourself. You stop chasing, and you start choosing. You stop surviving, and you start designing. That's where the real shift begins. When you no longer fill your life with noise and clutter, you make space. Space for stillness, for depth, for meaning. And in that space, you discover something the world doesn't teach you, that you were never meant to be everything. You were meant to be yourself, fully, simply, powerfully. And the more you return to that truth, the more you realize. Sophistication isn't about impressing, it's about expressing. It's about finding the most elegant, most honest way to show up, without the extra, without the performance, without the noise. And once you've tasted that, once you've experienced the quiet strength of simplicity, you'll never crave the chaos again. You'll stop confusing complexity with value. You'll start seeing through the distractions. And you'll start building a life that doesn't need to shout because it speaks clearly in every detail. Simplicity is not the absence of depth. It's the presence of clarity. Somewhere along the way, we confused the two. We started believing that to be deep, we had to be complicated. That to be profound, we had to be hard to understand. That simplicity was basic, maybe even boring. But that's a lie. Simplicity is not the lack of thought. It is thought refined. It is understanding distilled. It is wisdom compressed into a single beam of truth. Anyone can sound complex. It's easy to hide behind big words, messy systems, layered distractions. But it takes courage to be clear. It takes discipline to subtract what's unnecessary, not just in what you say, but in how you live. Because clarity reveals what matters. It cuts through noise like a blade. It doesn't wander. It doesn't hesitate. It speaks straight to the core. And in a world where confusion is everywhere, Clarity feels like lightning, like peace, like freedom. Think of the people who changed your life, truly changed it. It wasn't the ones who overwhelmed you with cleverness or complexity. It was the ones who made things simple, who helped you see, who didn't fill your mind with more, but helped you remove the fog so you could find what was already there. That's the power of simplicity. It uncovers. It doesn't decorate the truth, it reveals it. And that's what makes it sophisticated, because sophistication isn't about excess, it's about elegance. It's about knowing what to leave out and trusting what remains. The same is true for who you are. You don't become more valuable by adding more noise, more layers, more identities. You become more powerful when you clarify, when you remove what's performative and step into what's essentially you. That's not emptiness, that's depth, because now there's nothing in the way, no confusion, no contradiction, just alignment, just truth, just you. But simplicity like that is rare, not because it's hard to understand, but because it's hard to choose. Complexity gives you places to hide. Simplicity demands that you show up, fully, openly, honestly. That's why it's so strong, because it cannot lie, it cannot pretend, it can only be. And that kind of being, stripped down, rooted, undeniable, is what we crave most, in ideas, in design, in relationships, in leadership, in ourselves. We don't want more, we want clearer, we don't want louder, we want truer. And clarity, born from simplicity, is what gives us that. It's not easy, it's not always fast, but it's the only path that leads to peace. And when you've tasted that peace, the kind that comes not from having everything, but from knowing exactly what you need, you'll never chase clutter again. You'll stop chasing distractions dressed as goals. You'll stop measuring success by quantity. And you'll start creating from a place of stillness, of purity, of precision, because that's what simplicity is. Not smallness, but sharpness. Not emptiness, but essence. And when your life begins to reflect that, even in small ways, your days get lighter, your mind gets quieter, your impact gets deeper, and your presence becomes more rare. Not because you're doing less, but because you've stopped doing what doesn't matter and started becoming someone who does. We live in a world that rewards complexity, but respects simplicity. Look around and you'll see it. People applaud the complicated. They admire the layered, the flashy, the excessive. We give awards for multitasking, for innovation packed with noise, for solutions that seem smarter simply because they're harder to understand. But deep down, we crave something else. We crave clarity. We crave calm. We crave the rare kind of intelligence that doesn't make things harder, but makes them obvious. That's what simplicity does. It walks into a room full of chaos, and it brings everything into focus, not by dominating, not by performing, but by removing the fluff, removing the performance, removing the ego. And in doing so, it creates space for something sacred, truth, because simplicity is what remains when the show is over, when the filters are gone, when the words stop. And that's why it earns respect. It doesn't beg for attention. It doesn't try to impress. It just is. Solid, unshakable, clear, and that kind of presence, in a world addicted to more, to louder, to faster, is unforgettable. But here's the catch. Simplicity is often overlooked at first. It doesn't always get the spotlight. It doesn't scream for applause. In fact, it often gets dismissed. Too basic, too minimal, too plain. But simplicity doesn't care, because it knows something complexity never will. It lasts. Trends are noisy. Substance is silent. Hype fades. Clarity stays. And when everything else falls away, simplicity is what we return to. Not because it dazzles, but because it works, because it makes sense, because it feels right. You feel it in design, in writing, in music, in speech. The simple things are the ones that endure, not because they were trendy, but because they were true. That's why you respect them. Even if you didn't notice at first, they stay with you. They echo long after the noise fades. And the same is true in life. You can build a complex persona full of ambition, aesthetics, and achievement, but if it's not rooted in something clear, something real, it won't hold. It'll crack under pressure. It'll collapse when the noise stops. But a simple life, a clear mind, an honest heart, a quiet confidence that holds, that weathers storms, that earns trust, that earns respect. Because in simplicity, people can finally see you, not the projection, not the performance, you. And there's something deeply magnetic about that, because it's so rare, because it's so clean, because it's so human. In a world full of performance, realness becomes revolutionary, and realness is born from simplicity, from not needing to explain everything, from not hiding behind complexity, from standing in your truth, gently, steadily, without apology. And here's the paradox. The simpler you become, the more powerful your impact. Because now you're not diluted, you're not scattered, you're focused, you're intentional, you're whole. And people can feel that. They might not say it, but they sense it. In your presence, in your words, in your way of being. That's respect. Not forced, not demanded, earned through alignment, through clarity, through simplicity. Simplicity isn't subtracting for the sake of less. It's subtracting until only truth remains. The world has confused minimalism with emptiness, restraint with lack. But real simplicity is not about being bare. It's about being pure. It's about refining something, your words, your life, your thoughts, until everything that isn't essential falls away. And what's left is not less. What's left is real. In a culture obsessed with more, simplicity is misunderstood. It's not about avoiding, it's about choosing. Choosing not to carry what weighs you down, choosing not to keep what clouds your clarity, choosing to build your life around depth instead of decoration, because you only get so much energy, so much focus, so much time. And if you give it all away to what doesn't matter, what will be left for what does? That's the wisdom of simplicity. It's not just about cleaning your space, it's about clearing yourself. Removing distractions, yes, but more than that, removing illusions. Illusions of worth based on accumulation. Illusions of success based on speed. Illusions of identity based on noise. Because none of that lasts. And deep down, we know it. That's why we keep seeking the feeling that simplicity gives us. Peace, clarity, alignment. We feel it when we walk into a quiet room, when we hear a clear sentence, when we meet someone who doesn't need to prove anything. There's a kind of strength in that stillness. It says, I know who I am, I know what I'm not, and I don't need to dress it up. That's what makes it so powerful. Because anyone can add, but very few can take away the layers of ego, fear, and performance, and still stand strong, still stand whole. That's the goal. Not to be noticed for having everything, but to be remembered for what you held onto after everything else was stripped away. Simplicity doesn't seek attention. It doesn't demand applause. But it speaks with precision. It lands with weight. It has nothing extra, and that's exactly what makes it unforgettable. You don't remember the cluttered, you remember the clean. You don't remember the loud, you remember the clear. The same applies to people. The ones who stay with you aren't always the most decorated. They're the ones who lived with integrity, who knew what mattered, who weren't afraid to let go of what didn't serve their soul. That's the kind of simplicity we need more of. Not an aesthetic, not a trend, a way of being, a way of walking through the world without excess, but never without essence, a way of leading without forcing, a way of speaking without shouting, a way of living without performing. And that kind of simplicity isn't born overnight. It's earned through presence, through intention, through 1,000 tiny decisions that say, no, not that, that's not the truth. And eventually what's left is a life that speaks for itself, not through decoration, but through depth. Not through style, but through substance. A life that whispers clearly, cleanly, confidently, "This is enough. I am enough." And that's the most sophisticated message you could ever send. Simplicity is what you arrive at, not what you start with. It's not a default setting. It's a destination, a truth you slowly uncover, layer by layer, as you walk through noise, through chaos, through confusion. You don't begin with simplicity. You grow into it. At first, life feels like a collection of more goals, more input, more effort. You gather, you chase, you stretch yourself in every direction because you think that's how success is built, through expansion. But eventually you realize it's not about expanding outward, it's about deepening inward. It's about subtraction, not addition, not adding more to your identity, but removing what never belonged, not stacking more commitments, but protecting the few that truly matter, not becoming someone else, but returning to who you've always been. That's what simplicity offers. Not a smaller life, a clearer one, a truer one that makes sense to you, even if the world doesn't understand it, and that takes time. That takes courage, because getting to simplicity means facing the weight you've been carrying, the roles you've been playing, the expectations you've inherited but never questioned. And it means letting them go, one by one, thought by thought, until you're no longer living from default, you're living from design, not chasing aesthetics, not copying someone else's version of minimal, but choosing with intention what stays and what leaves, who you're becoming and what no longer serves you. And slowly the clutter starts to fade, the pressure eases, the noise softens, and something sacred takes its place: stillness, focus, clarity. You begin to notice more with less. You feel more free with fewer options. You speak more honestly with fewer words. You create more impact with fewer distractions. That's not regression, that's refinement. And it's the mark of mastery, not just in your craft, but in your being. Because the most powerful lives don't shout. They don't overwhelm. They don't need decoration. They resonate. They hold space. They invite you to feel something real, not through drama, but through depth. That's what simplicity does. It doesn't just make you efficient, it makes you honest. It doesn't just make you look calm, it makes you present. It doesn't just make things cleaner, it makes them clearer. And in that clarity, people find something rare, something magnetic, something timeless. Because in a world that keeps rushing, the one who moves with quiet purpose becomes unforgettable. And the life that isn't cluttered with everything becomes anchored in what matters most. So no, simplicity isn't something you stumble into. It's something you earn through choice, through awareness, through presence. It's what remains after you've removed what was never you. It's the sophistication that speaks without excess, the elegance that arrives without performance, the power that's quiet but undeniable. And when you arrive there, when your life becomes simple, not because it lacks, but because it's true, that's when you realize you never needed more to be enough. You just needed less of what never mattered.